largest cavalry battle of the Civil War, Major General James Stewart fought in the Battle of Brandy Station, and during this battle, he was commanding the Confederate cavalry. He found himself surprised by the Union cavalry. They were completely surrounded. Stewart's forces were scattered across the battlefield. They were completely caught by surprise. They had been attacked. They had been killed. Some of his units had been pushed back. And at one point during the battle, Stewart's men from all areas that he had them scattered through came running back to him saying, Sir, we are surrounded." Stewart's reply is famous. It's so famous, in fact, his words get put into a number of other characters' names and a number of other battles in wars that were never fought by him. But he says, "Well, now they can't get away." What do we do when we're surrounded? In Stewart's case, historians and tacticians debate his methods and the attitude that his response reflects, saying, well, maybe it was his sort of cavalier attitude that caused him to be surprised in the first place. Maybe that's why the whole event happened, was because he wasn't really that great. Some people say, well, his military career shows that he was actually a pretty decent leader, and this was just sort of a in-the-moment kind of military humor response that they have. How do we respond when we feel surrounded by the enemy? In our world today, Christians often give off the impression that they are surrounded on all sides. We can look to the rise of persecution globally. There's hard data backing up some of those facts. We could look at the shift in national politics away from our traditional American roots and belief. We could look at our society becoming more progressive. We could look to the marketplace where we work, where our jobs are, and see where corporations and businesses are getting on board with agendas that we might not agree with, and where these are being pushed down to their employees and enforced. We could see where just society and cultural in general, movies, film, the arts, etc., just has a complete anti-Christian bent right now. We could even look at just kind of our friend group and our community and realize everyone kind of just wants Christians to be quiet. And all of this, combine it together, and it creates this effect that we feel surrounded. How will we respond? Are we like Stewart? Or are we going to be cavalier? Is our attitude what has led to this point of being surrounded? How will we respond? Are we going to turn and look to the places that have better politics, better culture? Will we just move to somewhere that we think is safer for us as a Christian? Or are we going to respond like Stewart did? Are we going to understand, what is my purpose? What is my purpose? What am I made to be? And if I'm made to be a certain kind of thing in God's kingdom, and God has put me in the thick of the fight, maybe that is the right attitude to have. Well, they can't get away now. We've just finished our sermon series on the gospel at work. And through this series, I encouraged you to see your work as having purpose in God's kingdom, to see your connections inside your place of work as being a place that God wants to redeem. Where you can develop friendships, where you can develop relationships, where you can begin to make disciples. That this is the place, that the workplace is where mission is going to happen in the future. And maybe you were sitting here the whole time going, okay, that sounds good, Brian, but that's not very realistic. You don't understand where I work. You don't understand my boss. You don't understand our policies. Okay, fair, I don't. But I think in this book of Daniel that we're going to be going through, I think you're going to see a case where God gives us someone where there's no easy answers. There's no get out of jail free card that, he prays and then it's all over. There's none of that. In fact, it seems to go from bad to worse for Daniel and for all of the captives. And so I think God has given us a kind of test case for us to look at and to go, is my attitude about where I live, is that right? Or can I thrive as a Christian? Can I follow God and his mission in a place that seems to be diametrically opposed to him? So if you have your Bibles this morning, let's open to the book of Daniel. We'll be in Daniel chapter 1. I'm going to go ahead and read the first half of the chapter because it's introduction to the book today, but some of the introduction's actually in the text, so that's really helpful. I'm going to start reading verse 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So this tells a dramatic story is unfolding in front of us. These youths, among many other young Jewish people, had been brought into captivity. But I want to start with the question of how did they get there? This story isn't happening just out of the middle of nowhere. There's a narrative that leads up to this. And so if we go all the way back to the book of Leviticus, we see that God, in chapter 26, we're not going to read all of it today, but I encourage you, go home and read all of it. It's fascinating. It moves through several different phases of how God is projecting, how he's promising that he is going to work with his people. And so the first of these is blessing. We see this in Leviticus 26, verse 3. It says, "If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and your land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last to the time of the grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall last to the time of sowing. You shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land securely. I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I will remove harmful beasts from the land, and the sword shall not go through your land." So God is giving them this promise. They're in this sort of middle space where they have come out of Egypt. They've been rescued from the land of Egypt. They're wandering through the wilderness, through the desert, and God is giving them his law and his instructions. And with his law and instructions, this chapter has a carrot and a stick, and this is the carrot. If you obey my commandments, if you do these things that I've been telling you should do, if you walk in my ways, I will bless you. I will bless you, I will bless you, I will bless you. That's what he's saying. But also with his promises, we always think that God's promises are good. You ever go to the Christian bookstore? Do they even have Christian bookstores anymore? I don't know. Back in my day, when they had Christian bookstores, you'd go in there and you'd see just so many kinds of Bibles, and one of them was the God's Promise Bible. And it was just every single promise in the Bible is highlighted. But also, if you looked carefully, what you would realize is that it was only kind of the good promises that were highlighted there. It was not ever the bad promises. And so like the promise to bless, that's a promise, a good promise. We want that promise. But there's also the second kind of promise, and that's if you don't walk in my ways, I'm promising to curse you. And so there's the God's cursing study Bible. I don't know why that never caught on. But the same chapter in Leviticus, he gives all of these. Here's what will happen when you obey, but when you don't, here's what's going to happen. Starting in verse 14, it says, "But if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, if you spurn my statutes, if your soul abhors my rules so that you will not do all my commandments but break my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will visit you with panic, with wasting disease and fever that consumes the eyes and makes the heart ache. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you, and you shall be struck down before your enemies. Those who hate you shall rule over you, and you shall flee when none pursues you. And if, in spite of this, you will not listen to me, then I will discipline you again sevenfold for your sins. I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like bronze." This is some dark promises from God. Here's what will happen if you obey, I will bless you. Here's what will happen if you don't, I will curse you. Now that chapter goes on and essentially says, when you don't obey and I've done these promises, guess what? There's one more promise, and that is I'm going to bring you out of the land. And so again, take some time this afternoon, read Leviticus 26. It's kind of a three-part story there. But the book of Daniel opens up with the reign of King Jehoiakim. And I want to read out of 2 Kings. This is sort of the historic portion of the Bible, 2 Kings, chapter 24. He's telling this exact side of the story. In verse 1, it says, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him the bands of Chaldeans and the bands of Syrians and the bands of Moabites and the bands of Ammonites. And he set them against Judah to destroy it according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants, the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, also for the innocent blood that he had shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon. Now the rest of the deeds of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. So here he's saying, this is the same time period. God sent the Babylonians in to take them into captivity, but he gives a little bit of a reference. He gives a reference to what Manasseh did. And I know that I don't need to remind any of you what Manasseh did, but just for the sake of all of us in the room, let's think about what did Manasseh do. I'm not going to read 2 Kings 21, but essentially 2 Kings 21 tells the story of Manasseh. He was one of the worst kings that they had. He rebuilt the high places. High places were places of worship. You go through the whole Old Testament, and it was something that the good leaders, the good judges, the good kings, they were always tasked with, go tear down the high places. These were places where they would set up idols, where they would set up Asherah poles, where they would do all kinds of pagan practices in worship of false gods. He made idols for Baal. He made Asherah poles. He built altars to pagan gods. He put these altars to pagan gods in the temple itself. So it's not just he's willing to go and worship pagan gods by himself. He wants to actually desecrate the holy place. And so when you read through the first several books of the Bible, you'll see how much effort goes into describing how the tabernacle was to be set up, how the temple was to be set up, how it was supposed to be purified, how everything was supposed to be organized. The process that even the priests themselves would have to go through before they went into service in this space. And here, in a place that's supposed to have the utmost of care as people approached it and interacted with it, now this place has become somewhere where one of the kings that God gave to lead Israel to follow him, that he has put an idol to a false god. Worst of all, he burned his son as an offering to pagan gods. He used fortune tellers. He used mediums and necromancers. Manasseh was a terrible, terrible person. So Manasseh gets a special call out in this, and yet he's kind of in line with everything that was happening at that time. If you go and read through the book of Kings, you'll see king after king where it says, he did all of the evil deeds that his dad did, plus some. This guy did all the evil deeds that guy did, plus some. And it just keeps going and going and going with very little break. There are a couple of good kings, but most of them are just bad. And so as a result of all of this, God has been patient with them and patient with them. He sent prophet after prophet to try to turn them back to his way. And finally, he said, I've had enough. So the northern kingdom is taken into captivity by Assyria. And then the southern kingdom was taken into captivity by Babylon. And that's the story that we see here. Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, he lays siege to Jerusalem. Jehoiakim surrendered to him. And through this process, he takes about 10,000 captives, along with all of the temple, the furniture and the articles and all of that kind of stuff, the temple gold, essentially. And so he goes and he ransacks the temple and he brings it back. So I want to look at Daniel himself, and I have 3 words there if you've got the handout: the man, the book, and the problem. And so we're introduced to him as the man, and we're talking about the book today. And so you might be asking, well, what's the problem with this? Isn't it just Daniel in the book? Well, to the casual observer, yes, that's what we would think. And that's going to be the position I land on, but I want to fill you in on a little discussion that's been had about Daniel. So the one question is, well, who is the author of the book of Daniel? When we study a book, we always ask this question. Most of the books of the Bible, they're very, very clear as to who wrote them. Most of them have some kind of claim of authorship. This is one of those where Daniel himself asserts throughout the book 3 or 4 times, he'll say, and I, Daniel, so he's writing in the first person, so he's definitely claiming that he wrote it. Now, when you say, well, what's the problem with this? So the problem is in modern scholarship, takes the approach that we're going to approach the Bible critically, like any other piece of literature. Okay, so we're not going to allow our faith assumptions to help us understand the Bible. We're going to be critical as we would with Homer or with the Iliad or the Odyssey or any other Greek play or legend. We're just going to approach it in the same kind of fashion. And so with that, they kind of take out this presupposition that you and I probably have of, well, we believe that God exists and we believe that the world is supernatural. So when I see a prophecy or I see a miracle described in the text, I don't wring my hands and go, oh, how do I deal with this problem? I just say, well, if God is real, as I believe he is, and if he created the world as I believe he did, then he's able to do anything as he in fact is. And so it's actually not a problem for me. But they would say, well, if you look at how accurate the prophecies in Daniel are, clearly that's a sign that it has to be written by someone at a later date. So it's not Daniel writing as the author. It has to be some other person hundreds of years later who saw these events after they took place. And he is simply writing more in a historical chronicling method. That is why it's so accurate, is it's written 400 or 500 years after the reign of King Jehoiakim. The problem with this, and I'm going to talk about why I believe it's written by Daniel in the time that it's written, but the problem with this, if for no other reason, in Matthew 24, Jesus believes that Daniel is the author. And so the moment you start doubting one part of the Bible, there's kind of this domino effect where you wind up having to doubt multiple parts. In Matthew 24:15, Jesus is talking. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place. Jesus is referencing both Daniel, the author, Daniel as the prophet, and as the author of this book, and he uses the phrase, the abomination of desolation. It's in one of the later chapters that we'll talk about several weeks from now. But apparently, Jesus does not share the assumptions that modern scholarship shares. And so if you're going to doubt Daniel as the author, you're going to have to doubt the words of Jesus at some point. But let's talk about the date. The internal claim here is that he's Nebuchadnezzar's hostage, that this happened probably 605, 604 BC. He served through the reign of King Cyrus. And so his whole tenure, Daniel's tenure in these various governments was about 70 years. Again, for the longest time, the date was not contested until modern scholarship got its hands on it and says, well, hang on, it can't be right. If it's so right, it's too right, and so it has to be wrong. Before they did that with it, everyone just said, okay, it was written in the reign of King Jehoiakim. But there's one of the things that they would say is, well, there's certain theological points that Daniel makes that we don't see in the Bible up until much later times. For instance, Daniel talks about angels. And that is a period, like angels aren't talked about in the Bible till much later in it. The problem, though, is this overlooks dozens and dozens of references to angels, starting in the books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Job, Psalms, Isaiah, Hosea, and Zechariah. So sure, other than those references, it is a later theology. I'll grant you that if we just write off, the first third of the Bible, sure. The really interesting thing with that claim is I spoke last week about the Sadducees, and one of the beliefs that the Sadducees had was that they did not believe in angels. And this was, I was preaching from Acts about the people in prison being released by an angel. And I said there's a point of irony there because they did not believe in angels. So if Daniel is promoting belief in angels, it can't be written later. It has to be written earlier when it says it was written. Another point that they make is they say, well, languages. So Daniel is a very unique book in the sense that it's in multiple languages. It's in both Hebrew and it's in Aramaic. Chapters 1, the first chapter, and then chapter 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, and then the middle section, 2 through 7, is written in Aramaic. And so it's a fascinating book in that regard. People believe that it's based on who is the audience that Daniel is talking to. And so in the opening chapter and the closing chapters, they would say, well, the audience is the Jewish people, that Daniel is addressing them, and these are not concerns that the larger Babylonian audience would have had. However, the book very quickly moves. If you look at the title on chapter 2, mine says Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Maybe yours says something different. But very quickly, the book shifts to what is happening in the Babylonian kingdoms and the Persian kingdoms. And so they would say, well, that's why he switched languages. But coming with this is the fact that Daniel uses not just Hebrew and Aramaic. He uses a number of Greek words, and he uses a number of Persian words. And so people would say, well, he would only use the Persian words as an addition from later times. Remember, Daniel's career spans 70 years. And so you think about, well, what were the empires that went through? There was the Babylonian Empire, there was the Persian Empire. If it was written 400 or 500, 600 years after this date, the Persians are kind of nobody at this point. Why on earth would Daniel be including Persian words if it was written much later? The fact that he's including Persian words meant that it was written when the Persians were in power and when he was serving them, just as the book says. People say, well, okay, there's Greek words in there. There's Greek words for certain instruments. Language is a fascinating thing when you study both the combination of language and geography. To think, well, we just think, well, our words are English and English is English. But that's not actually true. Our English is made up of German. We have a lot of Greek words. We have any fancy word is probably coming from French. A lot of medical terms are coming from Latin and Greek. I mean, we just have this amalgamation of languages. We don't consciously think when I say something with the word ology at the end, I'm using a Greek-based word. We just use that word. So why would we not allow Daniel the same privilege? We think of the ancient world as, well, these people live there and those people live there. But Daniel is working for guys that are building empires. They're taking over the world. If you look at a map of the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, you can just about lay them over each other. You know, the borders shift a little bit here and there, but largely it just changes the name of who owns the same piece of ground. The ancient world was surprisingly cosmopolitan. And so it's as in our world where words move from one culture to the next, it's not at all surprising that they would be moving in this time either. And so the purpose of the book of Daniel is one of the favorite books of the persecuted church. You go to most of the rest of the world, especially if they live under, say, communism, if they live under some kind of oppressive religious regime, and ask them, what's your favorite book in the Bible? They'll probably say either Daniel or Revelation. Why? Well, one, it talks about God's people going through persecution. And number two, at the end of the story, God wins. The battle that they are fighting in front of them might feel like a losing battle, but they read the story and they go, you know what? I might not be saved right here, right now, but God is going to come back and he is going to be the victor. And so this is one of their favorite books. This book demonstrates God's power over all time and over all places and over all rulers and over all dominions. It demonstrates that even when life seems like it's not going according to God's plan, that this dissonance that it creates is simply part of God's plan. Finally, this book points us towards the Messiah and his reign in the end times. So how bad was it during this time for them? When we look at verse 2, I'll read it again. It says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. One of the major themes of this book is God's sovereignty over the nations and the rulers and time and history and even the future. And yet, this is happening at a time when his people are being taken captivity, where his house is being plundered, where his name is being mocked, even by his own people. But Daniel starts with this word, the Lord gave Jehoiakim. In the Hebrew, he uses the word Adonai. which is the word for Lord. He doesn't use the word Yahweh, he doesn't use the word Elohim. These are words that would mean God. But he uses the word Lord, which in the context of the Bible does mean God. But it means God in a certain kind of way. When we describe a Lord, we are meaning someone who has rule and authority and power. In the New Testament times, they use this word kurios. Kurios is not exclusive to the Bible. Kurios was a word that was used by the Romans. When you wanted to pledge allegiance to the Roman Empire, when Rome came in and defeated you, you would make a pledge of allegiance and you would say this phrase. You would say, Caesar is kurios. Caesar is Lord. He is the dominant one. He is the sovereign one. He is Lord over it all. He's it. That's what that phrase means. And so Daniel is making a claim. The Lord said, here's what the Lord did. He is the one who is sovereign. Now think of where Daniel's sitting right now. Daniel's sitting in captivity. Daniel, probably at the time he wrote this book, had gone through many years of a very difficult life. And he's saying, it's the Lord. That's who this is. In New Testament times, when people would transfer their allegiance from Caesar as Lord, and they would say, I'm following Jesus now, they would say, Jesus is kurios. Jesus is Lord. He is the one who is sovereign over everything. It's easy to believe in God's sovereignty when everything is going well. And if that were happening in this book, I don't think it would have the gravity that it does for modern readers. If it was just, hey, God's people won the battle and they were safe all the time and everything went swell, we probably wouldn't care much about this book. But it's the opposite of this. This is a tale of danger and oppression, and yet we see God's hand and his sovereignty. How can we trust that God is in control when life is falling down around us? This is one of the questions that they would have been wrestling with. So Daniel says, the Lord, and he uses this word gave, the Lord gave. How did they go into captivity? Was Israel outsmarted militarily? Were they outwitted? Were they outmanned, outgunned? Were the Babylonians just bigger, better, stronger, badder? No. God wasn't taking a nap at that moment. God wasn't not caring at that moment. God wasn't being passive and just letting life happen at that moment. God gave. God gave at that moment. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. God is not out of control. Even in a story where everything is going terribly, God is still the active party involved here. The Lord gave them into the hands of the Babylonians. God allowed everything in this story to happen. The text today is going to lay out a 4-step process that the Persians used to break down their captives and try to transform them into loyal Babylonian subjects. Now, in our world, it's easy to think of your national identity and your religious identity as two separate things. You can be American, and you can change your religion to be whatever you want. It can be no religion. It can be some other religion. It can be a made-up religion. And so you can kind of not question your nationality, your Americanness, based on your religion. You can be American and be anything. But in this time and place, you were whatever empire you were under. What their religion was became your religion, which is great if that's where you grow up and that's your religion. But what do you do if you're saying, no, I'm following a different God? It's fine when you're in your homeland, but now that you're captured, now that you're held captive, now what do you do? So there's a 4-step process they went through. Number 1 is isolation. We see in this text that they're deported, that they're held in captive. These young men, when you see what they were, verse 4 says, youths without blemish, good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. These are the top-notch young people that Israel had to offer. And King Nebuchadnezzar scoops them up and says, you're mine now. Not only are you in this land, I'm going to put you through my own process. And step number 1 is isolation. We're cutting you off from the rest of this. Your translation might say that he took them into Babylonia, which is true, but more literally it says it took them into the land of Shinar. The land of Shinar is a very specific reference. It's a reference to the land between the rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates. The very first time we see this place mentioned is the Tower of Babel. Right after the flood, they get off the ark, and it says they go into the land of Shinar. It's this nice place where they can live and grow and build a city, is what they did. This is a place where everything except for honoring God seemed to be happening every time someone came through here. They brought them into the land of Shinar. This is a place that valued upward mobility, making a name for yourself. This is the place where he brought them. God is giving us, or Daniel is giving us a very specific reference. He's not using this modern one. He's using this old one, and I think it's kind of a tip of the hat of this is a place where bad things happen. But if we remember all of those stories, it's a place where God's story triumphs over the stories that they were writing. The vessels of the temple were also brought into this place. The Babylonians would have been wondering if this Yahweh was worthy of worship. He can't even protect his own people. He can't protect his own house, his own things. Look at how they're plundered and brought into here. Wars at this time, they were fought in partnership with a patron deity. You don't just go to battle because it's a strategic option. You go to battle because you believe that your God is the one empowering you to go to war. And if you win that war, that makes a theological statement that your God was in fact the right one and theirs was the wrong one. You're not fighting about theology, but you can't remove theology from fighting and from empires at this time. They were one and the same. So Babylonians would be wondering, hey, this Hebrew God, this Yahweh guy, he's not that great. He can't protect his own people. The Jews would have been wondering maybe something similar. Why trust God if he won't protect us? They knew that the captivity was not a lack of his protection. It was the fulfillment of the promise of punishment. But even so, how were they supposed to be faithful to a God in such a place and in such a culture? They're isolated. They're brought into captivity. There's another little word that's used where they're put under this person's tutelage. His name is Ashpenaz, and he is the chief eunuch. Now, before I press too hard on that, let me just say this word in Hebrew has more than one meaning. One of the meanings is eunuch. One of the other meanings, though, it speaks of Potiphar. So if you go back into Genesis and read about Potiphar, it uses the same title to speak of Potiphar in his position inside of Pharaoh's government. So it doesn't have to mean eunuch. Potiphar obviously had a wife, and we presume was not a eunuch because of that. However, in empires in the Near East, using eunuchs to take care of the palace, to be around the king's harem, this was a very common thing because they were not a threat to the king and his interests. And so for a moment, we don't have to say that he's actually a eunuch, but that's probably what he was. The fact that they're put under Ashpenaz, the fact that they're put with the head eunuch probably means that this was something that the Babylonians did to them as well. This isolation would have been difficult for them. Step number 2, though, we see that there's an indoctrination that goes on. They came up with this education plan that was going to last 3 years. There's an Old Testament theologian who talks about what Babylonian education looked like, and he says Babylonian texts indicate that the schools of the day, they copied sign lists. Sign lists would be like astrological signs. Word lists. Word lists would be things like magical words that possessed a kind of power. Think of like a mantra or something like that. They could possess legal materials, all kinds of religious documents, fables, omen texts, including those about devils and evil spirits, astrological and mathematical texts, economic data, as well as historic materials. So this would have been a very fascinating education system. It would have been well-rounded in the sense that it includes religion, but much of the religious things that it would have included would have been things that you or I were very concerned about. This is like the School of Hogwarts right here. I often ask homeschool kids, what's the first book you read after you're an adult? And oftentimes it is Harry Potter. That carries a certain kind of stigma inside conservative Christian homes. But they're essentially sent into the School of Hogwarts here for 3 years. Imagine being a Jewish parent hearing our son got carried off. The grandkids that we thought were going to have, that line has literally been cut off. And now they've put them in this school of magic and sorcery and wizardry and learning all of this stuff. Now, this learning magic is not just a religious idea for people in these times and cultures. Magic actually presented an official function. You remember when Pharaoh with Joseph in the book of Genesis, one of the things he consults is his wise men and his sorcerers to try to figure something out. This was a very common thing. And so if you want to go to war, you don't just find a strategic time, do your research, build your troops, build your army, and then go attack. You would also consult your sorcerers or your shaman who would try to determine, typically based on astrology, what is an auspicious time? At what time should we attack that the gods, the universe, the planetary systems would favor us over our enemies? And so them learning magic had an official function where they would be expected to be the advisors to the king. When he says, hey guys, when should I go to war? Go do your whole magic thing that you spent 3 years learning. Let me know the right time. Do you want to continue the lineage of the king? Do you want to find a spouse for the king? What do? You consult a sorcerer. You consult the shaman who's going to find who is the smart match, who is the right person for the king to marry so as to produce the right line to give heirs. Do you want to know the future? Consult a sorcerer. So this school of magic and wizardry that they're part of, it's not just a religious thing. This has an official function inside of their government, and we're going to see this throughout the rest of the book. Step number 3 is assimilation. These young men are given the king's food and the king's wine to drink. This is an attempt to bring these young men into the king's confidence. Where is the place in culture where relationships are developed the deepest? It's around the table. Where are ideas shared? Around the table. Where are alliances formed? It's around the table. But more than this, the food in this table would have been sacrificed to idols. The same idols that the Babylonians thought were responsible for helping them have victory over the Hebrews, that's the idols that they would be sacrificed to. Meals are a celebration. Hey, we just won a victory. Yeah, it's over your people, but hey, let's eat. Guess what? This food, it's sacrificed to the God, our God that's better. You're welcome. Now you're in a superior kingdom. You can have a superior God who's actually going to do something for you. Come on, let's eat. Enjoy. Celebrate. You've moved up in life. Partaking in this food would have been the same as celebrating their victory. Meat sacrificed to idols, meat with blood in it, non-kosher meat, unclean animals, all of these things for an observant Jew, these would be on the no-no list that you cannot eat from. They would have been problems. Now, one thing I have to say, and if you've done this diet plan, it's fine, but this is not a diet plan. People talk about the Daniel diet. This is not a diet plan. That's not the purpose of the text. This is why we read books in context. Step number 4 is domination. When one regime takes over another regime, there are often ways that they try to bring the losing people under control. And language is one of those things. We even see this in the modern world. In Sudan, the reigning government there was largely Muslim, and so they wanted to enforce Arabic as a language. And so in the kids' schools, they try to weed out any of the tribal tongues that people grew up with. I got an ESL certificate with a guy from Sudan, and he talked about their religious practices. He said their educational practices. He said they would give you a card. If they heard you speaking, he spoke Nubian. He said if they heard you speaking Nubian, your teacher would hear you, he'd go, aha, and hand you a card. Now, you would then take that card, and you don't want to be the one holding the card at the end of the day. Why, you ask? The person with the card gets a beating at the end of the day. And so you go to one of your friends, and you say, hey, don't you remember that song that our mom used to sing us when we were kids? Can you sing a few lines of that for me? And then the moment they do, you go, aha, here you go, I'm free now, right? And so all day long, they pass this card around from person to person, and the last one holding the card gets the beating. But even here in the States, this has actually happened. My grandmother grew up speaking Creole French. And from that time and place, there's photographs of kids at school, 7, 8, 9 years old, writing lines on the board, and the lines say, I will not speak French in school. I will not speak French in school. Now they're teaching it in college as a dead language. You wouldn't have to teach dying languages if you don't try killing them. It's a sad story on a personal level, but I'm also glad that I speak English and not Creole French, since English is sort of the language of the world. But this is something where people will come and they'll try to enforce one language over another language. Let's see how that happens. Daniel and his friends, they have this name. Daniel has the name, which comes out to the meaning, God is my judge. Hananiah has the meaning, his name means Yahweh is gracious. These are their Hebrew names. Mishael, his name means who is like God. Azariah means Yahweh helps. Azariah, that's actually the root name for the name Lazarus, which is the story from the New Testament of Lazarus. But they changed their name from these good names that speak of God, that speak of Yahweh, that speak of his rule. And Daniel gets the name Belshazzar. This means Marduk, protect his life. Imagine waking up one day and getting news of your son in Babylon. He's been taken captive. Your future has been cut off. And now you hear that his name has been changed. You go, what does that name mean? I've never heard that name before. They go, it means Marduk, protect his life. Marduk. Hananiah, his name changes to Shadrach. This means the command of Aku. Aku was the moon god. Mishael, whose name meant who is like God, he gets a little play on words with his name. His is from Mishael to Meshach, which means who is like Aku. Azariah, the one who says, Yahweh helps, becomes Abednego, servant of Nebo. Nebo was the second highest god in the Babylonian pantheon. They tried to dominate them by changing their name, by erasing their linguistic past, by erasing the theology that their names represented. Let's take those names that your mother rocked you in the cradle with and prayed those prayers and sang those songs over you in the cradle, and we're going to give you names for Marduk and Aku and Nebo. This was a dark time for Daniel and his friends. I want to close with a couple questions and points. And maybe while we're talking about this, just ask yourself the question, how can we trust God when things are bad? How can we do that? In this book, God promises to win the war, not the battle. He promises to win the war, not the battle. We always focus on the battle that I'm in right now, and if it seems to be losing, I have serious doubts and questions for God. God, why? God, where are you? God, how long? All those kinds of questions and doubts. But God doesn't promise to win every battle. He doesn't promise to always fight on the case that I think I am fighting for on his behalf. Sometimes we're on a fool's errand. Sometimes we are caught up in his plan of judgment for a people. When God judges, the judgment just falls on everyone. Wins and losses fit into his sovereign plan. Next, God makes good on his promises, including the harsh ones. God has been promising through the whole Bible up to this point that if they continued, that he would judge them. And though this is harsh, it teaches them something about God. You can trust God. If God says it, you can count on it. Now, this is on the harsh side of the promises, but if they start going back and they start rereading those texts, they realize, okay, if we follow him, he'll bless us. Yep, we didn't do that. What does it say? Okay, next passage. Ooh, this is what's happening to us right now. If we walk away, he's going to punish us. Is that the end of the story? Nope, thankfully, third part of the chapter. But at some point, he's going to return us to the land. At some point, he's going to save us. And if we can trust his promise to bless, if we can trust his promise to curse, we can trust his promise to rescue. This should give us hope that he will keep all of his promises. He is a promise-keeping God. He speaks truthfully. Next, God uses our mistakes for his purposes. Our mistakes don't change God's plan. They don't derail him. They don't hamper him. There's one view of God which says, or God's will, which says, hey, God's will is like this target, and you need to find the bullseye. And anything that's not the bullseye, it's God's second best. It's God's less than best. Now, I'm not saying that God's will is causing us to sin. I'm not saying that the bad choices you make in life, somebody's lost. Find them fast. I'm not saying that lost person is part of God's plan. What I am saying is that these things are factored into God's will. I want to reframe that to say that God's will is so much bigger than our mistakes. It's so much bigger than our mistakes. If this were up to us, we should be worried. If my life turning out okay, if my kids turning out okay were completely up to me, I'm in a terrible state. I need to be worried a lot if that's the case. Thankfully, my mistakes do not dictate what God is going to do in this world. This is something that we can learn from. This can create an attitude of forgiveness and grace in our own relationships. When someone hurts you, you can say, you know what? The human side of this would say, you hit me, I hit you back. You curse me, I curse you back. But the godly side of this says, your actions are not going to dictate my response. My response can be loving, my response can be gracious, my response can maintain the relationship, even when your response is everything but that. Our sin does not hamper God's will. God's will, his plan, his sovereignty, all of these things, they are big enough to factor in our mistakes. I am not saying that we should go out and try to sin. What I'm saying is that the fear of that, oh no, I messed up one thing, now my whole life is messed up, God can't use it, it's always going to be off the rails. This is not actually a concept from the Bible. Even when everything is going wrong, when people try to isolate, assimilate, indoctrinate, and dominate us, God is not done. This is not the end of the story. Yes, I'm ending us on a dark note. I think it's important that we kind of feel the desperation that they would have felt. This sermon, after all, is titled A Stage of Despair, so I kind of need to leave you in despair. But the rest of the book is going to be hopeful. But I want us to kind of not move past that feeling that just put yourself in the parent's shoes. Get a letter from your son, from your daughter, that would have been during this time. These aren't the only people. Esther's written at a similar time and place. Just imagine getting a letter home from one of them and going, here's what's gone on in my week. What's that despair that you would feel? And then ask yourself the theological question, is God sovereign? Can we really trust him? And yet, we have to realize we're only in chapter 1. Daniel is giving us this introduction to a whole book. And so God is not done. The fact that something is blowing up right now in our life is not a prediction or a prescription that it's always going to be this way. God is not done. We're only in chapter 1. Let's pray. God, it is so easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking when things are going great, you're in control and you are worthy to be praised. And the moment things start going off the rails, this leads us into a spiral of doubt, of criticism, of cynicism, of disbelief. God, I pray that as we walk through this book, it's not a story about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. It's a story about you. It's a story about how human sin fits into your ultimate plan that's not derailed by our choices. How very powerful and even wicked rulers do not present a challenge to you and your plan and your will. How you are sovereign over everything. God, as we walk through this, I pray that we would just embrace all of the feelings that come through this book, the despair, the feeling of being surrounded, of being outnumbered, the feeling of not being in power, of powerlessness. But God, that we would also look to the hope and the faithfulness that you are. You are faithful, God. I pray that this would give us hope in our day-to-day life. Not just, okay, great, a cute story from the Bible that we all remember from Sunday school, but that this would really lead us into believing in you and hoping in you and trusting in you. This we pray. Amen.